of these actions. And while I'm not going to get into details about describing the unit or this particular event, I will be satisfied when I get the report that we have looked closely at the potential.
We take you now, the House is coming back into session to take votes on 3 bills, 2 dealing with financial regulations.
And nays. H.R. 2682 by the yeas and nays, and agreeing to the Speaker's Journal of approval of the Journal de novo. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. Remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2779 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2779, a bill to exempt inter-affiliate swaps from certain regulatory requirements put in place by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
And the House taking a 15-minute vote on the Journal, and they'll be dealing with 2 financial regulations after this bill. They were scheduled to debate the Surface Transportation Bill earlier, but they recessed before taking that up. And just a correction, they're actually working on the regulation of financial institution swaps now. They debated this bill earlier today. And some news from the AP on the Surface Transportation Bill facing a likely defeat. House Speaker John Boehner canceled the vote on the extension bill. He said that the Congress is in the midst of a bipartisan conversation about a short-term extension of the highway bill, and in order to facilitate the conversation, that House vote was canceled. And without action by Congress, the government's authority to spend money on transportation programs and levy federal fuel taxes will expire Saturday. Democrats estimate that as many as 1.8 million construction-related jobs would be at risk, and also the government would lose about $110 million a day in revenue in uncollected gas and diesel taxes. That's some of the news coming from the Associated Press. And across the street, lots of activity today at the Supreme Court. Justices finished up the first of 3 days of oral argument on the constitutionality of the health care law. They looked at whether the court was taking up the case prematurely, according to a tax law that says a court cannot rule on a tax case until the tax has been paid. C-SPAN has been covering the Supreme Court's oral argument on the health care bill today, and after the arguments, one of the attorneys spoke with reporters afterwards. Gregory Katsas represents the National Federation of Independent Business and several other groups, and he argued that the tax penalty for enforcing the health care law's individual mandate can be challenged before it takes effect.
How are you? Hi, I'm Karen Harned. I run National Federation of Independent Business and Small Business Legal Center. We're one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, and Greg Katsas argued for us and the states today on why the Anti-Injunction Act does not apply to bar this lawsuit. Greg, do you want to give your impression?
Sure. It's a fairly technical jurisdictional issue, but at bottom the question is whether the individual mandate is a tax. There's a special rule that makes it harder for litigants to challenge federal taxes, the President of the United States was very clear that this insurance mandate is not a tax. There's a requirement to buy health insurance. That's what we're challenging. It's backed up by a penalty. Penalty is not a tax, and we think there's no bar to our coming into federal court to challenge this unprecedented obligation to buy a good or service that consumers don't want.
How did the justices take to the argument? Can you talk a little bit about the justices and how they seem to be going, or what their questions reflected?
No, I think they asked good questions at both sides. It's always hard to predict. I think the questioning was good. There wasn't anything that we hadn't anticipated. They certainly seemed to recognize a lot of the difficulties in the other side's position, but I'm not going to make a prediction one way or the other.
Justice Roberts seemed to take exception to this idea that you know, the tax, it didn't matter. You could go to the individual mandate without touching the tax. He was very emphatic about that.
He asked a skeptical question. On the other hand, Justice Kagan was very emphatic that the requirement is a separate requirement for all sorts of obvious reasons. It's described as a requirement. It's backed up by a penalty. There's separate exemptions from the mandate and the penalty. There are good reasons why Congress would have wanted to do it that way. And Congress was less nihilistic than people are suggesting. They understand that there's effect to imposing legal obligations, because at least some people will choose to follow the law even if they won't be fined for breaking the law.
What was you to your clients from the mandate as being the fact that there will be additional people taking advantage of they'll be required to get coverage under Medicaid.
In Medicaid. That's the state's. That's one of the state's interests in challenging the mandate. My clients are private individuals who don't want to be forced to buy health insurance, and NFIB, both as an organization that represents those individuals and in its own right.
A little bit about the jurisdictional question. Why is that so important?
Whether the Anti-Injunction Act is jurisdictional? Well, the government in this case is affirmatively arguing that the Anti-Injunction Act doesn't apply. So every party to the case thinks the Anti-Injunction Act doesn't apply, and they're the sole beneficiary of this statute. Even they don't think it applies. So ordinarily, the court would just not have to consider the issue at all because the government isn't pursuing it. The only circumstance in which they would have to consider it against the wishes of all the parties is if it were jurisdictional. And the court has cut way back on what counts as being jurisdictional exactly because it produces these very weird circumstances where courts have to consider issues that nobody wants them to consider.
Was there anything that surprised you at all that came up today? Questions or?
No, not hugely surprising. We spent a lot of time trying to think through all the contingencies and.
You got the questions from the justices you thought you'd get questions from?
Yeah, pretty much.
Why did the court take this unusual step of hiring somebody to argue an argument that nobody in the case seems to care about?
This goes to the question about jurisdiction. There's at least an argument that the Anti-Injunction Act is jurisdictional. If it is jurisdictional, they would have to consider it on their own. So they wanted help. They wanted someone to support the position that it is jurisdictional and it doesn't apply. That's why they had to appoint the amicus, but the awkwardness of that procedure, having to do things that way, seems to us a very good reason for not construing ambiguous statutes to be jurisdictional, like this one.
You did feel that they came down, that the question was largely on the side that it is jurisdictional but does not apply. Did you feel that was where you wanted to go?
I don't. It seemed like there were a lot of skeptical questions of the other side on the jurisdictional point, but I think they asked me, you know, I had some tough questions on those points as well, so I don't want to draw too strong an inference just from the tenor of the questioning. We do think our position on this is strong.
What's your name again?
Gregory Katsas, K-A-T-S-A-S, counsel for NFIB and the private individuals, and also appearing today on behalf of the states as well.
Thanks for coming out.
Thanks. See you all tomorrow.
That was Attorney Gregory Katsas from earlier today after arguing the Supreme Court's health care bill case was premature. The Associated Press reports it didn't appear that the justices found the case had been brought too early. Tomorrow, more coverage on the C-SPAN networks, including oral argument at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN 3, C-SPAN Radio, and cspan.org. And here on the floor of the House, in the middle of a 15-minute vote underway on deregulating financial swaps, those regulations were part of the provisions in the Dodd-Frank Financial Regulations Bill. Members in the House on the floor for a 15-minute vote on deregulating financial swaps. The House and Senate will be out after this week for a 2-week spring break. And checking in on the president's schedule, President Obama is on a 3-day trip abroad. Today was the second day of his trip, and he made a speech about stopping the spread of nuclear weapons at a university in Seoul and held meetings with the leaders of Russia, China, and Kazakhstan. His talk with Russia's Dmitry Medvedev is making some news after some of his comments were caught off mic. He told the Russian president that he'd have more flexibility after the November election to deal with the issue of missile defense. And members in the House in a 15-minute vote on deregulating financial swaps. After this, a vote on the Business Risk Mitigation and Price Stabilization Act of 2011. It's going to be 2 of 3 votes that they're going to take tonight. And the House and Senate, again, are going to be out after this week. They're going to be on a 2-week spring break. And here on C-SPAN, Washington Journal tomorrow morning is going to be devoted entirely to special guests and topics dealing with the health care law as the Supreme Court hears oral argument through Wednesday. Starting at 7 a.m. tomorrow, we're going to hear analysis of the arguments from today and a look ahead to the next argument in the court, which is dealing with the individual mandate. And then a discussion about the individual mandate and arguments for and against its constitutionality. And that's going to be on Washington Journal tomorrow morning, starting at 7 a.m.
The yeas are 357, the nays are 36. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2682 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2682, a bill to provide end-user exemptions from certain provisions of the Commodity Exchange Act and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
And as we just heard, a 5-minute vote on this, one more after this one will be coming up today. They were also scheduled to take up the surface transportation bill, but Speaker Boehner postponed that vote. Democratic leadership was getting members to vote against the bill, and a spokesman for the Speaker says that that bill will come up sometime later this week, according to the Associated Press. And tomorrow, more from the Supreme Court on the second of 3 days of oral argument on the health care bill. You'll be able to hear the argument on our companion network C-SPAN 3 at about 1 p.m. Eastern Time, or listen via C-SPAN radio or go online to stream it at cspan.org. And up on C-SPAN's Facebook page now, viewers are weighing in on whether cameras should be allowed in the Supreme Court. You can join that conversation at facebook.com/cspan.
369. Yeas are 24.
Mr. Barletta. Mr. Barletta votes aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 370, the nays are 24. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the question on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal, which the Chair will put de novo. The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it.
Speaker.
The journal stands approved.
Madam Speaker, request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
This is the last vote scheduled for the evening, the first vote of the evening on deregulating financial swaps passed. And also over in the Senate, a vote in favor of cloture on a bill to roll back tax breaks for the oil industry passed. That was a cloture vote of 92-4. The 4 senators voting nay were Mark Begich of Alaska, James Inhofe of Oklahoma, Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, and Ben Nelson of Nebraska. And also checking in on President Obama's schedule, he's on a 3-day trip abroad. Today was the second day of his trip, and he made a speech about stopping the spread of nuclear weapons at a university in South Korea, and he held meetings with the leaders of Russia, China, and Kazakhstan. And during his talk with Russia's Dmitry Medvedev, he's making some news after his comments were caught off mic. The AP reports that the president told the Russian president that he would have more flexibility after the November elections to deal with the issue of missile defense.
110, and the nays are 80. The journal stands... Oh, and 4 answered present. The journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Madam Speaker, I send to the desk a privilege report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 595, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 3309 to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to provide for greater transparency and efficiency in the procedures followed by the Federal Communications Commission.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed.
Requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Question unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
And Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The House will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. The gentleman deserves to be heard. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the founders purposely defined the role of government in the U.S. Constitution to protect, quote, we the people from the chains of government. Today, the United States Supreme Court began 3 days of oral arguments on the nationalized health care law. The issue, whether or not the federal government has the constitutional authority to force citizens to buy government-approved insurance. But much more than that is at stake. Mr. Speaker, if this law stands, it is the end of limited government as we know it, and the beginning of unlimited government is forced upon the people. Citizens are frightened. Our ancestors were forced to pay a tax on tea, so they threw the British tea in the sea. This nationalized health care law should be thrown into the sea of government oppression. If the Supreme Court upholds this law, we will be on a path of return to the philosophy of the British Crown, where Americans were mere subjects of omnipotent, unlimited government. Then the constitutional days of limited government will drown in the abyss of the sea. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise my amendment.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to continue my calls for justice in the murder of Trayvon Martin. It has been 30 days since his death, exactly 1 month since the Sanford police actually talked to the killer as he hunted and pursued young Trayvon with a loaded gun in his pocket. From every indication and every piece of evidence we have, George Zimmerman was the aggressor in this case. This is a classic case of racial profiling. He pursued Trayvon as he walked down the sidewalk. The police dispatcher said, "Stand down. Leave the boy alone." And Trayvon ended up dead. A small 17-year-old from Miami who we all love. This is not a victim we will forget, though. We will fight. We know who the killer is. We will not be quiet. I demand justice for Trayvon. I demand justice for Trayvon's family, and I demand justice for all of America's murdered children. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, everywhere I go, Americans are feeling the pinch of high gas prices. In response, the President has begun to claim he supports the Republicans' all-the-above energy policy. Although the words sound inclusive, a glance at the record suggests President Obama really means none of the below. The policy is none of the below on federal lands. On average, the Bush and Clinton administrations leased more than 3 million acres for oil and gas development per year. The Obama administration has leased less than 2 million acres per year. On federal lands, oil and gas production is down in the last year. There are now fewer offshore production facilities in federal waters than have been for more than 50 years. Do the President's policies matter for gas prices? The Washington Post argues that global oil prices are being driven up by a decline in global supply relative to demand of about 1 million barrels of oil a day. That's a lot of oil. But let's keep that in perspective. It's less oil than the Keystone XL pipeline President Obama blocked could carry each day to U.S. refineries. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
Address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the phrase, "it's never been done before," has often been used as a deterrent for many of the world's first. But thanks to teamwork, discipline, and avid determination, the Providence Academy Lions girls basketball team won their very first state championship game in their school's history. So I want to congratulate Providence and recognize their hard-fought road to victory. It's an incredible game. The Lions erased a second-half 7-point deficit to take the win in the Minnesota 2A girls basketball state championship game, proving that it's not over until the final whistle blows. When asked about the game, it was team member Marianne Healy who remarked, "We all went out there as hard as we could." Mr. Speaker, these young student athletes truly extol the hard work and poise of champions. On behalf of all Minnesotans, I'd like to congratulate the team, also congratulate Coach Finley and the parents of these athletes and the entire school as you celebrate your win. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Are there further requests for 1-minute speeches? The chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leaves of absence requested for Ms. Corinne Brown of Florida for today, Mr. Jackson of Illinois for today and the balance of the week, and Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
To address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend and to yield to my colleague from Florida, if I may.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and amend my remarks.
The gentlewoman has been yielded to.
Mr. Speaker, this is Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin's murderer is still at large. It's been 1 month, 30 days with no arrest. I want America to see this sweet young boy who was hunted down like a dog, shot in the street, and his killer is still at large. Not one person has been arrested in Trayvon's murder. I want to make sure that America knows that in Sanford, Florida, there was a young boy murdered. He is buried in Miami, Florida, and not one person has been arrested, even though we all know who the murderer is. This was a standard case of racial profiling. No more. No more. We will stand for justice for Trayvon Martin. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to add any extraneous material on the subject matter of the special order.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the statement of Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, soon we'll be called upon to vote on a budget for 2013. Budgets are supposed to be a statement of our values and our vision, and that is the case with the Congressional Black Caucus budget. The values we support in our budget are American values. As it says in the title, it restores America's promise and invests in our future. And at this time, I'd like to yield such time as he might consume to the person who leads us in developing the Congressional Black Caucus budget and who has done so for several years, one of the senior members on the Budget Committee, Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia.
Thank you, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, we have difficult choices to make when it comes to addressing our budget deficit, but the Republican budget makes the wrong choices by deeply cutting vital programs like Medicare, Medicaid, education, job training, and transportation to pay for massive tax cuts that primarily benefit the wealthiest Americans. Our nation's communities of color have been hardest hit by the effects of the Great Recession, and the Republican budget does little to address the priorities of these communities. Even as our nation's economy has created nearly 3.9 million private sector jobs since February 2010, communities of color are still experiencing disproportionately higher rates of unemployment, home foreclosure, educational disadvantages, and economic hardship. As a result, vulnerable communities are increasingly relying on public programs to meet their basic needs. With the passage of the fiscal year 2011 continuing resolution, then the Budget Control Act of 2011, and the fiscal year 2012 Consolidated Appropriations Act, these same vital programs have been slashed and targeted for even deeper cuts in the House Republican budget, even as tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans are extended without problems. The Congressional Black Caucus has a long history of submitting fiscally sound and morally responsible alternatives to budgets proposed by both Democrats and Republican presidents. The CBC alternative budget for fiscal year 2013 continues that long tradition, putting forth a plan that reduces the deficit over the next decade, alleviates some of the harm inflicted by the Budget Control Act, and increases economic opportunities and job creation by ensuring sustained investments in education, job training, transportation and infrastructure, and advanced research and development. The Congressional Black Caucus budget proposes significant increases in these functions of the budget for fiscal year 2013 to further accelerate our economic recovery and ensure our recovery is felt at every corner of our nation. At the same time, the CBC budget protects and enhances Social Security, and the social safety net that saved millions of families from poverty during the Great Recession. Unlike the proposed Republican budget, the CBC budget does not significantly reduce Medicaid or cut food assistance or force seniors to contribute more of their hard-earned money towards their health care expenses by dismantling Medicare and other vital support services. The CBC budget achieves all of this by making tough but responsible decisions to pay for tax cut extensions by making our tax system fairer, closing corporate loopholes and preferences that have contributed to the loss of American jobs. Deficit reduction and the path of fiscal responsibility must not be on the backs of our nation's most vulnerable citizens. We cannot win the future by leaving our most vulnerable behind. Our success as a nation is interwoven in the success of every community, and this goal is reflected in the Congressional Black Caucus alternative budget for fiscal year 2013. Now, let me go through some of the details of the budget, because many of the budgets that have been presented in the past have missing numbers or unspecified cuts or things that you know aren't going to happen. These are our recommendations for a budget and where we are on the bottom line. The CBC budget starts off with an assumption as its baseline, all of the President's spending and revenue assumptions. The CBC budget then not only extends certain tax cuts, but also pays for all of the tax cuts for hardworking middle-class Americans, and then it enacts tax reform measures to pay for the extension, raising nearly $4 trillion in revenue over the next decade. We do that by reining in Wall Street speculation with a financial speculation tax. That'll raise approximately $840 billion over 10 years, ensuring Wall Street bankers
pay the same rates as hard-working Americans by taxing carried interest, dividends, and capital gains as ordinary income. That will raise almost $1 trillion over 10 years. Enacting the Buffett rule and adding a millionaire surcharge, similar to the legislation that was in the House version of the Affordable Care Act. That will raise approximately $600 billion over 10 years. We closed certain loopholes, tax loopholes and preferences. There are so many of them that we can, by closing those loopholes and deductions, raise $1.3 trillion over 10 years, and ending the mortgage interest deduction for vacation homes and yachts, which will add a few $1 billion over 10 years. The bill then protects Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food assistance, welfare under TANF, unemployment insurance, and other vital safety net programs that are hit hard by the Republican budget. We restore important funding for programs that were cut under the Budget Control Act. It cancels the sequester of the security and non-security programs. We match the Democratic alternative budget on defense, invest another $153 billion over the next decade in vital programs that will accelerate our economy and support hard-working American families. We do that by increasing the maximum Pell Grant by $1,000 to a total of $6,500. We invest an additional $25 billion above the President's budget in education and training in 2013 alone. We also continue unemployment benefits and provide benefits for those who, no fault of their own, have been unemployed for more than 99 weeks. We invest an additional $50 billion in job-creating transportation and infrastructure programs in 2013 alone, and $155 billion over the President's budget over the next decade. We match the independent budget for Veterans Affairs as recommended by the Coalition of Veterans Groups. We invest $12 billion more in advanced research and development programs like NASA, Department of Energy, and National Science Foundation, which will create jobs now and in the future. We have additional funding for housing, foreclosure assistance, and other important programs in community development. We provide an additional $10 billion in vital health care programs, such as community health centers. And we create a public option under the Affordable Care Act, giving American people a real choice when the exchanges come into effect by allowing them to pick as one of their choices a public option. That has been scored at $100 billion savings because those programs will cost less. $100 billion over 10 years can be saved by adopting a public option. When the dust settles, the CBC budget will reduce the deficit by an additional $769 billion compared to the Republican budget over the next decade. Let me say that again. We will reduce the deficit by an additional $769 billion compared to the Republican budget over the next decade. It is more fiscally responsible. It addresses the needs of our public, and therefore I would hope that we would adopt the Congressional Black Caucus budget and not the Republican budget that will be presented on the floor. Thank you, and I yield back to the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands.
Thank you, Congressman Scott, and thank you for your leadership in all of these years on developing such a responsible budget. The CBC is proud to offer that as an alternative again this year. And now I'd like to yield such time as she might consume to Congresswoman Marcia Fudge of Ohio, who's a strong advocate, now back on Education and Labor Committee, congratulations, and a strong advocate for education and closing the achievement gap and for many of the safety net programs that we protect in this budget.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to thank my colleague, Representative Christensen, for her work and to continue to anchor this CBC hour. I think it is very, very important. She is very special because she is determined to make sure that the United States knows that we, the CBC, are fighting for them every day, and I thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise to address the devastating impacts that the Republican budget would have on the middle class and American workers, as well as students, seniors, and the poor. A budget, Mr. Speaker, is a reflection of priorities. It exemplifies objectives and goals. The Republicans' priorities are clear: cut taxes for the most wealthy Americans, while achieving deficit reduction through drastic spending cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, and other important programs. The Republican budget would abandon the economic recovery we are in and implement policies that ship American jobs overseas. It would assume deep cuts in transportation spending next year, ignore job creation, and reject sensible proposals for economic growth and future competitiveness. The Congressional Black Caucus will present a budget this week, thank you to my colleague Mr. Scott, will present a budget this week that would protect seniors who rely on Medicare, the disabled who need Medicaid, and the unemployed who would go hungry without SNAP. It would support our economy through investment in transportation and infrastructure and encourages American innovation. The Republican budget would reject investments in innovation by cutting funding for research and development. It would ignore the benefits of these investments on future generations. Should the Republican budget go into effect, we would miss a great opportunity to support American innovation and develop emerging technologies that create the jobs of the future. In addition, the Republican budget would fail our students by proposing drastic cuts that would devastate education funding and increase costs for college students. It would allow higher interest rates on student loans starting this year and eliminate the income-based repayment plans that help graduates manage their loans. In contrast to the Republican budget, the CBC budget would increase the maximum Pell Grant by nearly $1,000 and invest an additional $25 billion above the President's budget in education and job training in fiscal year 2013. Alleviating state and local education budget cuts and protecting jobs for teachers. Even the middle class is not spared from the Republican cuts. The Republican budget would outsource jobs through tax policies. It would actually encourage multinational companies to ship thousands of jobs overseas while costing the American economy billions of dollars. By contrast, the CBC budget would ensure that Wall Street bankers pay the same tax rates as working Americans by taxing carried interest, dividends, and capital gains as ordinary income. The CBC budget would close corporate tax loopholes, adding approximately $1.3 trillion in revenue over 10 years. Just like last year, the Republican budget would end the Medicare guarantee and shift costs to seniors. Rather than having guaranteed coverage of benefits, seniors would receive a voucher. Yet the voucher will not grow as quickly as health care costs, simply shifting cost onto seniors. As the AARP pointed out, the premium support method described in the Republican proposal would likely price out traditional Medicare as a viable option, thus rendering the choice of traditional Medicare as a false promise. The CBC budget would support our seniors, working Americans, and the middle class, and the CBC budget will reduce the deficit by an additional $3.4 trillion as compared to the President's budget over the next decade. The Republican budget would repeat last year's attempts to drastically reduce SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, for struggling families. It would slash SNAP funding by roughly $130 billion over 10 years and completely eliminate categorical eligibility. SNAP is currently serving 47 million people, nearly three-quarters of whom are families with children. Throwing people off the rolls would make it practically impossible for people to afford a nutritionally sound diet. For 2 years in a row, we've seen Republican priorities and the Republican vision for the nation. Mr. Speaker, the Republican budget is the wrong plan for American workers. It is the wrong plan for families trying to put food on the table. It is the wrong plan for unemployed Americans, and the wrong plan for students, and the wrong plan for seniors. I urge my colleagues to support the budget presented by the Congressional Black Caucus and to vote no on the proposed Republican budget. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Fudge, and thank you for your strong defense of programs for children, for our seniors, and for families across this country. I'd